Putting it all together, anti-racism, a Jedi training presented by the Mid-Hudson Library System. These self-paced trainings are meant to help library staff members discover more about justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, not only in the workplace but the world at large. The questions asked throughout these trainings are meant for private reflection. This is the final training in our introductory series. We will be reviewing some terms and finally discuss how to continue our education. To understand what is meant by anti-racism, we must first define racism. We will use author Tiffany Jewell's definitions from the book This Book is Anti-Racist. Racism is personal prejudice and bias, and systemic misuse and abuse of power by institutions. Examples of institutions are the government, media and entertainment, business, housing, banks, the criminal justice system, education, and healthcare. Together, people and our institutions create a solid structure of racism through policies, rules, and opportunities that give more resources to one group than another. Racism is a part of our society, but it doesn't have to be. With the definition of racism in mind, we can now define anti-racism and understand what it means to be anti-racist. An anti-racist person is someone who is opposed to racism. Anti-racism is actively working against racism. It is making a commitment to resisting unjust laws, policies, and racist attitudes. Anti-racism is how we get free from centuries of living in a racialized society that keeps us separate and oppressed. Let's watch the following video of Ibram X. Kendi discussing the nuances between not racist and anti-racist.
Speaking of what anti-racists do, how would you define anti-racist for people who have not cracked open this book?
Sure. So I think in order to define anti-racist, I must talk about the more popular term, not racist, which stems from the phrase, I am not racist, which stems from when anyone in this society is charged with being racist, their response is, I'm not racist, whether that person is from the far right or far left. Right. You know, across the ideological board, when people are charged with saying and doing something that's racist, their response is, I'm not racist, or some say, I can't be racist. I can't be racist because I'm a person of color, because I'm a liberal, because I have a black friend, yeah. So on and so forth. And so historically, the phrase not racist, the identity of not racist, has been expressed by eugenicists, has been expressed by Jim Crow segregationists, has been expressed by white nationalists, even white nationalists who are writing a manifesto to then go and shoot at dozens of people at a Walmart in El Paso, Texas, write in their manifesto, I'm not racist. And so for me, fundamentally, we should not be identifying ourselves as not racist when white nationalists are identifying themselves in that way, and eugenicists. We should also be recognizing that it fundamentally has functioned as a term of denial.
No one becomes a racist or an anti-racist. We can only strive to be one or the other. Like fighting an addiction, being an anti-racist requires persistent self-awareness, constant self-criticism, and regular self-examination. This is from How to Be Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. Let us look at what we have learned in our previous trainings and consider how we can use it in our efforts to be anti-racist. Implicit biases are unconscious attitudes and stereotypes that can manifest in systems as well as in personal behaviors. Specifically, implicit bias refers to attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious way, making them difficult to control. Understanding your own implicit bias is a first step to changing your behavior. This is part of being anti-racist. If you haven't taken an implicit bias test, visit https://implicit.harvard.edu. Microaggressions are small, daily insults and indignities perpetrated against marginalized or oppressed people because of their affiliation with that marginalized or oppressed group. Here we are going to talk about racial microaggressions, insults and indignities perpetrated against people of color. But microaggressions are more than just annoyances. The cumulative effect of these constant reminders that you are less than does real psychological damage. Regular exposure to microaggressions causes a person of color to feel isolated and invalidated. The inability to predict where and when a microaggression may occur leads to hypervigilance, which could then lead to anxiety disorders and depression. Studies have shown that people subjected to higher levels of microaggressions are more likely to exhibit the mental and physical symptoms of depression. Recognizing microaggressions that you have perpetrated, apologizing when possible, and correcting your behavior for the future are all part of being anti-racist. Diversity in the workplace means fostering an environment where people of different backgrounds and experiences come together. But diversity in a group isn't enough. If everyone isn't given an equal opportunity to contribute and succeed, diversity on its own is meaningless. Inclusion allows everyone to hear and be heard. Werner Myers explains diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. By moving beyond diversity and seeking inclusion, we act anti-racist. For our purposes, we will define systemic racism as racism and/or inequality that is carried out and sustained by laws, rules, policies, and institutions. Systemic racism can also be called institutional racism. Systemic racism can be found in society in a number of areas, such as wealth, education, and employment. The thing to remember is that systemic racism is our collective fault as a society. By being aware of power dynamics and our own implicit biases, we can understand how policies affect each other and move toward a more just society. By noticing this, we can become more anti-racist. By looking at the definitions for both racism and anti-racism, along with the topics in our past trainings, we can now take a moment to reflect and see how these things may show up in our own lives and places of work. Let us watch the following video from Forbes magazine that shares 10 ways to promote anti-racism in the workplace.
Well, in the aftermath of the George Floyd killing and the racial protests and the upheaval, there really was a lot of angst. And in particular, I was really taken by this hashtag I saw on social media, which was, white people do something. One of the things that feels different about this moment is it does feel like it's not just Black people who are upset, it's everyone. And in particular, white people might be trying to figure out what their role is or what they should be doing. And it also hit me that if I was a white person, I don't necessarily know that I would know what I should be doing, particularly in the workplace as it relates to social justice. So in many ways, I just wanted to share just my perspective and not saying that this is the end all be all, but these are 10 specific things that white people certainly can do to try to promote equity and promote social and racial justice in their workplace. So as an individual, my first suggestion would be for a white person to just get to know more people of color. I mean, it makes sense. All of us tend to gravitate to people that we have a lot in common with. And so unfortunately, the downside of that is sometimes we can live in our own little cocoons. It's hard to trust a person you don't like, and it's hard to like a person you don't know. So that building block of breaking down, racial injustice and stereotyping and bias is just expanding your network and truly getting to know more people of color. That demystifies things and that minimizes stereotypes. So number two, I would say just call your friends of color and express some empathy. It's a really difficult time, frustrating time, and maybe just start a little bit of a dialogue. When George Floyd was killed and there was so much upheaval and racial unrest, a couple of my white friends reached out to me and I really appreciated it. And then from there, it kind of sparked a conversation. We started talking about race and what I thought and what they thought. And these are friends I've had for more than a decade, and I don't know that I can remember ever really having that sort of conversation with them in the past 10 years or so. So I really appreciated it. So I would recommend that. My only caveat though, because I'll be completely honest, I've gotten feedback from a lot of my Black friends who said they are not trying to spend like every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday educating all their white friends. So when I say call to reach out, it's just that. It doesn't mean that there's an expectation that it's going to be a racism 101 tutorial twice a week, but it's more so just to reach out, just to express some empathy as a friend. Talk to your children about race. So I think we do our children a disservice when we try to protect them from talking about the ugliness of race and the racial history, the history of discrimination in this country. They're dealing with a lot of these same issues, albeit in a different way. In terms of equity, in terms of character development, ethics, all of those issues might be playing out on the playground or at birthday parties or in other places in the classroom. So I think that as parents, we need to give them space to navigate those conversations and to figure out their own value system and figure out maybe why they have some of the beliefs that they have. We've got to challenge our own stereotypes. I think that if we go out to the world expecting everyone else to change, but not looking at ourselves, then we're not pursuing this in a healthy way. I think we first got to look inside and say, well, how did I grow up? What were some of the messages I received? And why do I think what I think? So I think it's so important that each of us, myself included, I've been doing this as well, start to think about where do I have stereotypical beliefs and where did they come from? So the next suggestion is speak up publicly. And I'm going to be the first to admit, much easier said than done. But in this moment, if we're really looking at moving the needle, we need to go beyond, liking tweets and posting memes and just agreeing that racism is abhorrent. Okay, I think we all can agree that racism is abhorrent, but the question is, what are we going to do about it? And too often, many of us, and I will include myself in that as well, we've honestly been part of the problem because we've sat back, and even though we didn't agree with the racist comments or we didn't agree with the process that was a little bit discriminatory, we didn't really say anything. We didn't really speak up. There's so many ways that each of us can speak up and take action. So another suggestion is don't work for companies that aren't diverse. That might seem obvious on one hand, or it might seem really extreme on the other hand, but I think that in 2020, it's just not too much to ask to work for a company that is actively trying to become more diverse or actively pursuing equity and social justice, or has achieved some level of diversity and inclusion. If your organization is doing neither, I would suggest that you might want to reconsider if this is where you can be your best self. So I'm certainly not saying go out and immediately quit your job. Obviously, most companies have work to do, and you can be part of the solution, and I can be part of the solution. Try to improve your organization. I absolutely think that leaders have additional responsibility. And the great news is they have additional opportunity. There's so many more things that leaders can do. So step one, find a few people of color in your organization who are doing amazing things and mentor them. Okay? Don't wait to be asked, or don't wait for a mentoring program. Go out and proactively find those amazing people and mentor them, sponsor them. Let them know that they have support. Let them shadow you. Introduce them to other people in the organization. That's access that is critical that you have that you can share with them. And then take it a step further. Challenge your peers to do the same thing. Mentorship is so key, and it can make a huge difference. You want to try to encourage objective processes. Why do I say that? Because subjectivity is where lots of bias can creep in. That's where we get the good old boy network, where, well, we're not sure why we prefer Bob over Leon, but we just kind of do. So instead of that, we really want to have highly objective processes with clearly defined criteria. Now notice with that, I think this is an opportunity to talk about the fact that people of color are not expecting lowered standards, they're not expecting special treatment. We want things to be fair and objective. Another thing we need from our leaders is their leadership in terms of ensuring there's diversity at the leadership level. Let's face it, it is so much harder for people who are lower in the organization to do that. So we really need leaders to step up. Oftentimes they're in these closed door meetings, they're in executive committee meetings or boardrooms. We need them to speak up. But certainly this is something that's critical that we expect of our leadership, to insist that there's more diversity on leadership teams and at the leadership level. So I think the great news is that there's something that all of us can do. We don't have to wring our hands or feel helpless or feel like there's nothing. These are just 10 things that came to mind for me, but you might have a different list, or some of your friends or colleagues might have other suggestions. That's awesome. You know, Black people aren't monolithic, just like no race is monolithic. So I can't speak for everyone, but I do want to reiterate the importance of taking action. This is a moment not just to sympathize, but to really reflect and think about, well, what am I going to do differently to really move the needle? We all can do something.
Continuing your work. Acknowledge that racism exists. Expand your network. Examine your own stereotypes and implicit bias. Don't be afraid to speak up. While it's okay to ask questions and seek out conversations, the responsibility for educating yourself and deciding how to change your behavior rests on you. Participate in a book discussion. Look out for more training opportunities, because being anti-racist is something to work on every day.